Friends, fantastic to have you with us again. James, very good to see you.
Good to see you too, Ian. Yes. Yeah.
I can't think of a joke to make at the beginning here, so we just sort of go straight into the subject of the passage, really, shouldn't we? So what
Uh,
do we sorry, have you got a joke that we could
no,
share?
I haven't got a joke. No, I'm
Oh,
delighted to go straight into the passage.
okay, great. Although we should remind people of the things we like them to do.
We should. Yeah. We do love you to click like
Click like on
on
the
the
video.
videos.
Yeah.
We love you to subscribe to the channel.
Yeah, that's the button down here. Yep.
To share on the social media.
On the social media, yes, indeed.
Yes.
Click on the link and then click and it'll give you a link you can post. Yeah.
Always good. And particularly we'd like you to comment on
Yes.
on any thoughts you've got on what we've been saying. That's always really helpful.
And this could be quite an interesting subject today to have a comment and conversation about, couldn't it? Because
I think
where are we in the lectionary?
Yeah, because we're in Mark 11, 1 to 11. It's the reading for what we laughingly call Palm Sunday.
Indeed.
And there is an alternative, actually. I mean, you can in the lectionary do the Palm Sunday from John 12.
Yes. But we're not.
But we're not going to do that, even though we've been in John for a couple of weeks, actually, haven't we?
We have,
really.
Yeah.
So we are going back to the Gospel of the year, which is Mark. And there's quite a bit in Mark 11, which is kind of needing to get your head around. People have different views on it. So it'd be interesting to see what people have to say.
Before we start, here's a quiz question for you, James.
Yeah.
Where do we get the term Palm Sunday from?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question because I think, if I remember rightly, it's only in John's Gospel. Actually.
It is. Well done. You passed. Ka-ching. Have a point.
Yeah.
I
think Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, I mean, Mark, as we'll see, has leafy branches.
It is. Lulabs. Lulabs.
So maybe it should be called Leafy Branch Sunday.
It is. But Luke doesn't even mention branches at all. So I say,
no, so it ought to be
Luke.
Cloak Sunday, I think.
Cloak Sunday, because that's the only mentioned. So
as we say, it's odd, isn't it, that it should be named after just one a feature that is only present in one gospel.
It is. And again, this comes back to this paradox. Everyone says that the fourth gospel is the spiritual gospel, but actually all the things, all the fact stuff that we actually get it from that gospel.
Yes, absolutely.
Which entertains me. So there we go.
Yeah.
Now, so we were in Mark 11. Now, it is just worth paying attention, isn't it, before you sort of plunge into the passage of what's come before, because I think the previous couple of episodes actually are really significant in terms of shaping the context. And of course, it's worth just reminding ourselves that the chapter divisions are an artifice. They were added in by Stephen Langton, the 13th century Archbishop of Canterbury, who also probably wrote the Magna Carta. So Mr. Langton, thank you very much. We're grateful for your chapter divisions, but we worry sometimes that they mislead us and think there's an abrupt change where we actually need to pay attention more to the context.
Yeah. Yeah, so and of course, immediately before this, we've had the story of blind Bartimaeus, who, in the context of this passage particularly, is this person who cries out, "Jesus, Son of David." That's interesting, isn't it? Because that phrase occurs again, or that allusion to David occurs again here in Mark 11. So that idea of the greatest king of Israel is Jesus, the new David. What's going on is right there, placed right in front of us by Mark. I think
it is.
But before that, of course, there's also another interesting connection in the story just before Bartimaeus.
Yes, this is the debate, isn't it, with the disciples about who's the greatest.
Yeah.
So and Jesus' response to that is of course to refute all their ideas and all their claims of greatness and say, this is looking back to 1044. Whoever wants to be the first must be the slave of all. Well, in the current context, talking about being slaves of others is a hot topic, isn't it?
It is indeed a hot topic this week.
And for even the Son of Man, there's that favorite title again, Son of Man. It's talked about the different elements of that. Did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a lutron anti-Apollon, as a ransom for many. This is Mark 10:45 is a really good memory verse. If you're into memory verses, this is another one to learn. Son of Man did not come to serve, but serve and give his life as a ransom for me. So, but this is interesting. I mean, we have found this in talking about the different passages in Mark. We've found this really acutely, haven't we? Which is that we find absolutely juxtaposed in this gospel the idea of Jesus's greatness and the idea of his humiliation. And you have it actually in the narrative shape here, don't you? Because on the one hand, you've got this episode about the Son of Man has come to not to be served, but to serve and give his life. And then he's immediately claimed as the Davidic king.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that verse 45, 10:45 acts as a kind of heading, doesn't it, over all that follows right through to the end of the gospel.
Yeah.
His life as a ransom for many. That is Mark's understanding, as it were, of what Jesus is doing. So it's really crucial that we get our heads around that.
It is.
Yeah.
Just a little. I was going to say there's a little connection here with something else. Now it's gone completely out of my mind as I was about to say it. Oh yes, sorry. What occurred to me is that it's interesting that it's framed in the active sense, whereas previously in this gospel, Jesus says he's been handed over, so it's like he's passive and he's the victim of it. But here it's quite clear Jesus is giving his life. He's not just the victim of circumstances. And it just reminded me of in John 10, I think, where Jesus says, no one takes my life from me. I give it up on my own accord. I lay it down and I take it up again. So there is a nice theological connection there between.
There is. And I suppose there's a question there about whether the fourth gospel is being Markan or whether Mark's being Johannine. But yeah, it's very much a feature of Jesus in John, isn't it? That he is in control, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we get to our actual passage. So we're in Mark 11 now, and verse 1. My TLIV says they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany, but actually I think it's better to say they drew near to Jerusalem, because actually if you know the topography of the place, the direction they're coming from up the back of the Mount of Olives, it says they approached Jerusalem. Well, they're not approaching Jerusalem because you cannot see the city until you come over the crest of the hill. And actually when you do come over the crest of the hill, I did this many years ago on a Palm Sunday walk. And it's a very steep walk down, actually.
It's a steep walk down.
Then it is quite dramatic as you come over the crest, and suddenly the city is laid out before you.
It's overwhelming, actually. It's overwhelming. I mean, I remember doing that and being very emotional about it, which entirely makes it entirely understandable that other incident in the gospel where Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. That actually, but it is overwhelming and it's sudden. So they're really on the back of the Mount of Olives. That this is what we need to get into our sort of geographical understanding. And these villages of Bethany, and we don't really know where Bethphage is, but they're in that.
Bethphage or Bethphage.
Bethphage probably is a better transliteration of it, isn't it? But they're both on that side of that eastern side of the Mount of Olives. Now, Mount of Olives running down the eastern side of Jerusalem, of course.
I think we have a slightly different view on who the they are as they approach. Now, because one is it could be Jesus just with the disciples in a small group, or it could be Jesus and the disciples and the pilgrim crowd. I'd kind of assumed it was with the pilgrim crowd, but you want to challenge me on that, I think, don't you?
I'm not entirely convinced by that, because I think there's one of the things that I think Mark is doing here is that there's actually a little bit of an inclusio, i.e. At the end of the passage. So that means
technical term you throw in.
Nice technical term, a sandwich, as it were, if you like, where you've got similar themes mentioned in the beginning and at the end, which encapsulate what goes on in the middle. And if you look at verse 11,
the end of our reading,
you have Jesus looking around the temple, then he goes out to Bethany with his disciples. And at the beginning, I think it seems more likely that he comes over the Mount of Olives with his disciples. Other pilgrims would have been going up to Passover from Galilee, those who went with him, but they would have been staying in all sorts of different places. So I don't think necessarily that this sort of long march, as it were, from Bethany would have necessarily had huge crowds with him. So
because as you say, as the pilgrim crowd came into the Jerusalem region, they'd have had to go to wherever they were staying with their family connections and so on. So
and I think the way that the narrative works is that you've got Jesus and the disciples at the beginning, Jesus and the disciples at the end, and almost in a sense you've got Jesus alone amongst the crowds in the actual act of entry into Jerusalem. And it seems to me that he is the sole focus of all.
Yes, it is. Well, and we'll come on to why that is, particularly when we get to those verses. I think that's right, though. So I'm really interested that Mark alone mentions the two villages, Bethphage and Bethany. And as you say, we don't know where Bethphage is, but of course the name is very significant, because the name means house of bait is house. House of unripe figs. But of course that's going to be really significant for Mark, isn't it, as Jesus comes into Jerusalem?
It is. And of course, the very next story is this. It's one of Mark's famous sandwich constructions. It's another
inclusio.
So you've got the the story about the fig tree, which is cursed, and then you've got the story about Jesus cleansing the temple, and then you go back the next day, and the disciples say, "Oh, look, Lord, there's no figs on the tree," and all that. And this is a metaphor, obviously, of the temple and the fact that it is no longer bearing fruit in the life of the people of God. And so we talk about this, don't we, as the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but actually the goal is the temple for Jesus. Actually, ultimately, that's where he's headed all the way through. So it ought to be called something else, but that's his destination.
Well, that's a nice, interesting connection, which hadn't occurred to me before, because actually when you do come over the Mount of Olives and you do see the city laying out before you, the thing which strikes you is the Temple Mount, even today with the Dome of the Rock on it, because it's really sparkling with the gold on the top. But in Jesus' day, it would have been even more striking because the walls were twice the height of what they are today. And right in the middle, you've had this absolutely dazzling building of the temple itself with gold leaf on it as well, and it was known as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And the fact that the Temple Mount is on this side, that side of the city would have been incredibly striking.
It would have been. How extraordinary.
Just going back to the connection with the fourth gospel, which we've mentioned several times before, again, the fact that he's coming to Bethany, and we immediately get into this question of and it's quite interesting. It seems to be in popular reading of this passage, people often say, "Oh, look at Jesus' miraculous knowledge, and isn't this amazing that he knows what's going to happen?" But actually, we know from the fourth gospel that Jesus had friends in Bethany, Mary and Martha, and of course, the whole Jerusalem focus of the fourth gospel tells us that that Jesus appeared to have a discipleship group based in the city. Quite a good distance from the Galilee disciples. But of course, the synoptics are so focused on on Galilee that we just don't get that element of it. But here is more evidence of it in Mark's gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. Jesus clearly had social connections there. So the idea that he could then make arrangements and all the rest of it seems entirely believable with people that he knew, people who trusted him, perhaps people who were believers in him. So and indeed, of course, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus would have had connections amongst, so he could have used those as well to make these arrangements. It's entirely believable, it seems to me. Yeah.
And it's noticeable that Mark makes a completely unnecessary reference to the villagers being on the Mount of Olives, because of course, if you know the geography, you know that.
Yes.
And the reason is not to do with the geography, but it's actually to do with, as we've noticed very frequently, Mark's quite subtle pointers to Old Testament allusions.
Yes, he is very subtle, isn't he? And one of the contrasts between this version of the Palm Sunday triumphal entry and that of Matthew's particularly is that Matthew, although written for Jews, is very explicit. We suppose it to be written for Jews. Is very explicit in these connections, and Mark is not. So Mark is, and of course Mark has this theme, doesn't he, going through the gospel of the sort of secretive Messiah, almost the hiddenness, Jesus, who's only actually accessible to those who
are in the know,
those who will press into knowing. And that's what I think he's inviting us to do here. But those allusions, of course, the Mount of Olives is, well, I mean, it's resonant, isn't it, in Judaism of particularly that verse in Zechariah, isn't it?
Yes, Zechariah 14, verse 4. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. It's giving you even more detail. And the Mount of Olives should be split in two from east to west. And also, but there's, again, going back to the Davidic theme, there's David's exile and return in 19 to 20 is, again, the Mount of Olives is really key in there. So, gosh, there's so many echoes and allusions there.
They just pile on top of one another, don't they? Yeah.
We get into the whole donkey thing, the colt
donkey scenario. Yes.
But again, it's so striking, isn't it? There's two things here. One is that we think the whole focus of this is the actual entrance into the city.
It's not.
Well, Mark does that in sort of like one verse, but then this whole thing about the donkey, the colt, he just goes on and on and on. He's very repetitive.
It's extremely repetitive.
Well, the other thing is lots of fascinating little bits of typical Mark and eyewitness detail.
Yes.
About the untying, and it's tied up. What does he say? You will find a colt tied there. No one else has ridden. Untied, bring it here. If anyone asks you, then they went outside. They went to the hut. They found it tied at a doorway. So we get some very specific detail.
Yeah, outside in the street.
And as they untied it, people standing and so on. And there's repeated emphasis on tying and untying the colt.
Yes,
isn't it?
That is very
much more so than the other Gospels.
much more so. And it seems, I mean, I think the obvious conclusion of this is that Mark is alluding relentlessly to the function of a colt in the Old Testament as a messianic symbol and a beast for the Messiah. And the untying thing is particularly interesting, isn't it? Because that looks like an allusion to Genesis 49, which actually we read only the other day in the morning prayer lectionary reading. You know, which is Jacob's to his sons when he's about to die. He's prophesying over them essentially, and he speaks of Judah binding the colt to the vine. That's really interesting, and that seems to be where this expectation comes from.
Joel Green, in his commentary on he comments on the parallel in Luke. He says this whole process, the untying of the donkey, this whole process is wrapped in the interpretive cloth of eschatological expectation and scriptural allusion. That's
well, it's so true, isn't it? Because you've got, I mean, I think I wrote down 4 connections with messianic allusions to the Old Testament or to the Mishnah that are here in the way Mark unfolds this process. You've got the idea of donkey being a mount of a Messiah. Zechariah 9 and Genesis 49, as we've said. You've got the commandeering of a beast of burden that is the prerogative of a king. That always puts me in mind of those Hollywood films where the FBI stop a car at random on the street, take the owners out, and requisition the vehicle on a car chase. That's kind of that's what I always think about. And so you've got that. You've got the idea of an unbroken beast of burden being sacred in Judaism. That's there in Numbers and Deuteronomy. And then you've got the idea, which actually I think comes from the Mishnah, that no one other than no one else may ride a king's horse. So if it's the king's horse, nobody else may ride it, because so all of that is right there in this unfolding that Mark gives us, which is so you are left in no doubt whatsoever.
No, indeed.
If you know those allusions and you're prepared to press into them, that this is the Messiah, the King of Israel.
Yeah, it is. Now, one little interesting tweak on that, which is in verse 3, where they're instructed to say, the Lord needs it and will send it back.
Oh, yes.
Now, but what's fascinating there is we might sort of fold that into this messianic thing, but in fact, in this gospel, Jesus is never addressed as Lord. He is in Luke, but never here. In fact, when they say the Lord needs it, what they're actually saying is this is a divine event. This is it's God who needs it. And again, there's that blending, as we saw right in chapter 1, where the path is made straight for God to come to his people. And then when we look for God coming to his people, we see the figure of Jesus.
Yes. So we would say this is a high Christology or something, wouldn't we? Yeah, exactly.
So that all happens. They get it, and then they throw the cloaks on because, of course, it's not been ridden before, so it hasn't got a saddle or anything like that. I don't know much about saddles in the ancient world.
No, nor do I. Nothing at all.
One thing I do know is that the Romans didn't invent stirrups, and it meant that they were very limited in their warfare on horseback.
Oh, really? How interesting.
And stirrups were invented much later.
Right.
So, and you can only, if you're a soldier on a horse, you can only actually lance somebody if you've got stirrups, because otherwise you do that.
Yeah.
So
well, having ridden a lot as a child.
Did you?
Yeah, enormous amount. And one of the interesting things is that riding a horse bareback or a pony bareback is jolly uncomfortable. That's all I can say.
Okay. Quick diversion, funny story. When I rode a camel in Morocco, none of the men ever ride camels. They say it's women's work. And I said, why is that? He says, if you're a man and you ride a camel, it scrambles your eggs. Anyway, I think you're alluding to something similar.
I think we may be on something there, Ian, yes, but probably not something to dwell on.
No, indeed. So, yes, now the fact that Jesus is riding on a donkey, this is again really striking for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, we haven't quite twigged on this, that in ancient Israel, well, in the first century Israel, people did not ride around; they walked.
No, they didn't. Absolutely.
Mary did not. I'm sorry, folks. At Christmas, Mary did not ride a donkey down to. She walked because they all walk.
Yeah, they're beasts of burden. They carry your stuff.
Yeah,
if you have one, if you're lucky enough to have one.
And therefore, all the pilgrims would be on foot. Therefore, Jesus getting on this donkey would then suddenly become very prominent and a focus of attention. Now, again, this is significant because how do the those in Jerusalem know who Jesus is. I mean, if they've actually met him, they might have seen, but I mean,
Yeah.
put some identical pictures up and there's no photos or anything.
No.
So suddenly Jesus becomes, I mean, having, as you said, been obscure and been in the crowd, he suddenly becomes very, very prominent because he's the only person
with height. Yeah, and riding on a donkey. And of course, the interesting thing also going on in the background here is that if you're a pilgrim, you arrive in Jerusalem on foot. I mean, that by definition is the process of ending a pilgrimage, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean,
so Jesus is no longer part of the pilgrim crowd.
He's not. No, he is unique and different, and that's what. Once again, you get this sense of Jesus being alone within the crowd, and I think that's really fascinating. But the idea that, you know, I mean, I'm walking the Camino for the second time in a few weeks, and you know, the whole point of going to Santiago de Compostela is to walk into town. You don't get the bus for the last bit of the pilgrimage. You know, that would be utterly miserable. No. The whole point of it is to, as it were, go at the pace of walking, which is the pace of life.
Yes, it is. It's this metaphor for the whole of life, which of course again a very Jewish metaphor that you know, the whole of Torah comes from the verb yada, which means to throw something down ahead of you, so you mark the pathway for you to walk.
Okay, right. Yeah,
and of course, you know, the followers of Jesus were known as people on the way.
Yes. Yeah,
so
indeed.
Same kind of idea.
Yeah.
People spread cloaks on the road, which was a natural way of, I mean, it's a bit like the red carpet, isn't it? You lay something out for somebody important. And then they do mention branches.
Leafy branches, yes.
Leafy branches.
Yes. Which they've cut from the fields. Another little detail. Yeah.
Interesting again, but as you say, not palms. So the mention of palms in the fourth gospel is a stronger allusion to the Hallel Psalms and praise and all that.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
And then they cry out Hosanna, which means God save us.
Yeah.
And then you get, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Jesus is, this is again from the
Psalm 118, I think.
118, yes.
One of the Hallel Psalms, the last of the Hallel Psalms, as you would go up to Jerusalem. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is passed into Anglican liturgy. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. It's in the middle of the Eucharistic prayer.
Yes, completely in the wrong place, it seems to me.
But completely in the wrong place, exactly. And I think people don't get that actually the original, of course, means all pilgrims, all who come to the Lord to find the Lord are blessed. I mean, that's what the Psalm is saying.
Yeah.
And you know, that's quite an interesting. People think, oh, that must mean Jesus, but actually, it's all of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who come
just
to the Lord.
Show if you take a text out of its context and
exactly,
it changes meaning, and then you get the explicit reference here to blessed is the coming. Now, it doesn't quite say blessed is the King who is coming. The other Gospels do that, but blessed is the coming kingdom. And again, just a reminder that the whole context of Jesus' ministry is in this sense of huge expectation of the coming kingdom, this sort of almost fervor of expectation. And is Jesus the one, you know?
Yes.
So the question of John the Baptist's disciples to Jesus, and in Luke's gospel, Zechariah, that, you know, the recognition of the salvation that they've longed for is coming, you know, by means of this birth. So
yes, and of course he's about to reconfigure the whole expectation of that messianic kingdom, isn't he? More so than ever in the week that's coming. Is the week's about to come. He's been doing that throughout the gospel, but it's particularly going to be focused now. So.
But just that touches on, I mean, in the written account, which people can find on the blog, I do include a description of Alexander the Great entering Babylon, and it's extraordinary, and that really is a triumphal entry, just this great procession of riches and wealth and the people he's conquered and so on. So, you know, you're left in no doubt. The city is left in no doubt. You don't resist Alexander. Look how mighty he is.
Yeah.
Of course, in complete contrast, this isn't really, as you say, we call it the triumphal entry, but this isn't a triumphal entry.
No. And it now ends on a sort of damp squib note, really, because he arrives at his destination, which is the temple.
Yep. As you said, the temple courts is where he goes.
And yet all he does is look around and leave for Bethany with his disciples.
What is that about? He goes in and he looks around.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting. It's one of Mark's favorite words. This looking around word. In fact, and Mark uses it. I think Luke uses it once, but Mark uses it 6 times in his gospel, and there's nowhere else in the New Testament. And it seems that Mark uses it very often in the context of almost exclusively, not quite, but in Jesus, it's all an authoritative looking around. It's a
sizing up the joint,
acquisition of knowledge. Yeah, casing the joint would be good. Yeah, and that he, through having done that, he entirely understands what is going on. Is the implication, and I think that makes it, that connects it with what comes, of course, the story about the fig tree in the temple, which is about to unfold on the following day, obviously. But yeah, it's an authoritative thing, I think. Yeah.
And not only does he know what's going on, he knows what's going to happen. He knows what the consequences are, and he knows what the consequences are of him arriving in the city, looking like the hoped for Davidic king who delivers people, and the opposition that's going to arouse.
Yes.
Well, let's finish then on, I'm going to read just the last paragraph from the written commentary on this, which again, people can find on the blog. So, and it's really reflecting on the contrast between Jesus' entry to the city and Alexander the Great's entry into Babylon. Not for Jesus, flowers and garlands, but ordinary cloaks and branches. Not for him, the splendor of a conquered army and his own troops, but the peasant crowds and even children. He rides not on a war chariot, but on a young donkey. He hasn't come to conquer the city. He hasn't come to conquer anything, but he's come to be conquered, to give his life as a ransom for many. This is not a ride to victory and glory, but it is a ride to service and death. And yet, in this way, Jesus will win a victory and will draw a people to himself. James, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. We've rattled through. There's lots to rattle through, but it's been great. That's what happens with Mark's Gospel, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And friends, thank you so much for joining us. And just remember to do those 4 things. If you can like the video, that would be great. Subscribe to the channel, and then you'll get the future videos as well. Do copy the link, pass it on to other people if you found it helpful, and do press us some questions. If there's something that we said you found is particularly helpful, or something you want to challenge or push back on, do that in the comments. And we look forward to seeing you next time. James, see you next time.
Thank you.